Blizzard Entertainment, what was once a prestigious company known for releasing masterful works of art that defined many of our childhoods and often set the standard of what video games in the genre should look like, is now reduced to a depressing, soulless husk of a studio that no longer knows what the concept of a fun game is. Sure, they can make something that's nice to look at and might be fun sometimes, but those are rare occurrences now, and instead what we get are a bunch of well-beloved properties that Blizzard have effectively run into the ground due to the mixture of greed, poor leadership, and straight-up incompetence. They have pretty much sold their souls to the devil, and because of that, they're now being passed around between publishers like a used napkin. I'm sure many of you guys have been fans of Blizzard games once upon a time, whether it be WoW, Overwatch, Diablo, etc. And I don't blame you if you're still holding out hope that they might one day return to their glory days. But looking at their behavior for the past 10 years, I think the chances of that are pretty slim. It's honestly pretty impressive how Blizzard have single-handedly killed the goodwill of a massive amount of their fans for each one of their games. If there was an award for collectively making every gamer around the world hate a single company, I think Blizzard would absolutely win it 100%. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying any of these games. If you still like playing them, then more power to you. But it's undeniable that Blizzard have made several poor choices with each of these franchises that ultimately degraded the goodwill of the property and alienated a large chunk of their fan bases. So let's take a look at the biggest Blizzard games right now and analyze how they've been running them and the current community sentiment around them. The first game is Blizzard's crown jewel, their ticket to fame, their piece de resistance, so to speak. Or in other words, World of Warcraft retail. WoW was once an industry titan within the MMO scene back in the early 2000s. It was a cultural phenomenon during its peak years. Everyone and their grandmother wanted to play it, and every MMO wanted to be like it.
When it comes out, man, I'm just gonna non-stop.
Easy there, big guy.
I'm sorry for my girlfriend, because, I'm just gonna keep playing.
World of Warcraft was so popular back then that every MMO game dev was making their game with the intention of being the next WoW killer. Now, most of them did fail pretty miserably at trying to kill WoW because none of them could ever realistically compete with something that big and widespread. But as we would find out years later, the only thing that could kill WoW was Blizzard themselves. Now, obviously, World of Warcraft isn't dead, far from it. It's still one of the biggest MMOs to this day, and not many games really come close to its level of popularity. But despite that, the WoW brand has been slowly losing its luster with its player base to the point where people would rather discuss how great WoW used to be rather than what it is in its current state, which from the looks of it, the common sentiment seems to be pretty mixed. So where did World of Warcraft go wrong? Where was the turning point in WoW's lifetime that permanently impacted the direction of the game? Well, to start off, the biggest red flag was in 2008, midway through the Burning Crusade expansion, when Activision and Blizzard would merge together to create Activision Blizzard, led by the most hated CEO within the gaming industry, Bobby Kotick. But for the most part, everything still went smoothly as WoW would still gain more and more subscribers throughout Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. It wasn't until 2011 with the Cataclysm expansion when WoW really started to take a turn for the worse. The end of Wrath to the beginning of Cata was around the time they introduced the Dungeon Finder system, which might sound weird because it's such a staple addition in almost every MMO today, but WoW was one of those special cases where it benefited from not having one. You see, World of Warcraft was originally supposed to be a game where you're just a random adventurer exploring the world on foot and interacting with other players you find out in your travels. And with the absence of a party finder, it forced players to interact with each other if they wanted to do any of the content like dungeons or raids. And this led to so many memorable moments where you're just interacting with random people in the game.
Oh, it's a lot better than we usually do.
Alright, thumbs up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Dragons!
The main draw of WoW was not doing the super duper endgame boss fights or getting the best gear score possible, it was just socializing with other people and making memories with other players. WoW was never about the endgame, it was about the friends you made along the way, as cheesy as it sounds. And with the addition of a dungeon finder, it significantly diminished the social requirement of joining a dungeon group, which a lot of people felt was really detached from the original spirit of the game. This was also the expansion where Blizzard started to make some drastic changes to the game, like completely revamping the entire map of Azeroth that removed some of the old areas that people loved, or completely changing the talents in each of the classes to be completely different than what people were used to. But one of the bigger reasons people had a problem with this expansion was because of the lack of content updates, which caused many players to drop the game during this expansion. It was so bad that Cataclysm marked the first time in WoW's history where the number of subs went down by about 3 million. This change would set a precedent that I'm not sure WoW ever really recovered from to this day. Now fast forward a couple of years to 2013 and we get the release of Mists of Pandaria, which wasn't really considered a bad expansion by any means, but it didn't do very much to staunch the bleeding player count. Now fast forward to 2015 to the Warlords of Draenor expansion, what is almost universally considered to be one of the worst WoW expansions ever. WoD was so bad that the subscriber count sharply dropped to the lowest it's ever been right after its launch. Blizzard had all but abandoned the development of Warlords of Draenor and essentially moved on to the next expansion midway through the current one, leading to lengthy content droughts. And looking back at what happened during this time, I'm not really surprised that it went like this. And it's pretty evident because WoD only had 2 major patches for the entire expansion where they would normally get at least 3. There just simply wasn't much content to do in WoD aside from raiding, and not everyone does that, so for those people, they were pretty much shit out of luck and had to wait for the next expansion. So after the disaster that was Warlords of Draenor, the next expansion, Legion, would drop to a pretty warm reception after a long series of disappointing releases. The next expansion after that, Battle for Azeroth, however, was met with a more mixed reception due to a number of gameplay issues that regressed a lot of the progress made in Legion. After BFA would be yet another expansion tied with Warlords of Draenor and the discussion of worst WoW expansion ever, Shadowlands. Shadowlands was considered to be a very unfun expansion by many within the WoW community for various reasons, but the main complaint was that many of the mandatory progression systems were made in a way to take up a lot of your time for very little reward, making them feel like a tedious chore that you have to do if you want to progress your character, only for it to be completely replaced by the next expansion. Now combine that with long and drawn out content droughts and a poorly written story that retconned a lot of previously established lore, and you have a recipe for one of the worst expansions in WoW history. Players were so largely dissatisfied with Shadowlands to the point where there was quite literally a mass exodus of players that hop-shipped to other competitors like Final Fantasy XIV, which at the time was still riding the high of the overwhelming praise of the best expansion ever, Shadowbringers. So many disgruntled WoW players were hopping over to FF14 that it literally caused the game to be sold out of digital copies for a while. This time period could easily be considered one of the lowest points in WoW's lifespan that I'm not really sure it ever really recovered from due to how many fans were just burned from the decades of poor decision making and questionable changes. Now we get to the present day with the Dragonflight expansion that set out to appeal and perhaps bring back some of the jaded WoW fans, but it seems like not too many were convinced that this was still the right direction for WoW to be going in because it was still very far divorced from the original intention of the game. The leveling experience that was once supposed to be the biggest draw of the game is now heavily accelerated to get you to the endgame faster. The leveling experience is now incredibly lonely, with the game essentially playing like a single player title with some multiplayer elements because you don't really have to interact with anybody until you start raiding. In fact, retail WoW is pretty rough to get into as a brand new player because the game doesn't really take its time to slowly introduce things to you. Once you finish the tutorial, you're just thrown into one of the more recent expansions because the game is designed to rush you along to get to the latest content faster. It's incredibly jarring to be dumped right into Battle for Azeroth's story with literally no context for any of the characters or lore surrounding it. How is a new player who has no idea who Jaina is or what connection she has to the lore supposed to get attached to these characters? And now all of a sudden she's branded as a traitor? First of all, who the hell are you people? And secondly, what the ever-living fuck happened before this? How is a new player supposed to get attached to this world when all of the backstory and context is thrown out the window? This game has 2 decades worth of expansions and content within it, and Blizzard just throws you near the end of all of it so you can get to the end game faster. Because of this, World of Warcraft never feels like a world, it feels more like an island that changes to whatever the latest expansion is. This decision is likely a middle-of-the-road compromise that tries to placate the already existing audience that likes to make alt characters so they don't have to go through all the expansions over and over again. New players be damned if they want the whole WoW experience. I would imagine that it's pretty difficult to find many genuinely new players playing the game because WoW doesn't really try to cater to them. So the game is currently stuck in this really weird limbo where it's not exactly dead because it's still the biggest MMO in the world, but it's not really growing either. And now today, Retail WoW is a completely different product than it was 20 years ago. Many of the questionable design decisions from earlier expansions that alienated a lot of the player base still remain present to the game to this day. The storytelling and writing are still a far cry from what made Classic so iconic, and the integrity of the game is at an all-time low because the introduction of the WoW token and Blizzard's general lack of care for them has allowed bots, gold sellers, and RM tiers to still run amok in the game while Blizzard turns a blind eye to the problem, even seeking to make a profit from it. Retail WoW is pretty much purely focused on catering to its already existing player base, and I would find it hard to believe that there's a sizable chunk of brand new players that stick around to the end game. However, there has been speculation recently of WoW's current sub count hovering at around 7 million, which would still probably put it as the biggest MMO in the world. But it's still hard to tell how many people actually sub for Retail WoW because this graph includes the people who sub for Classic WoW only. So if you take out those people, then I would wager a lot less than 7 million are sub for just Retail WoW. And that's the harsh reality for Blizzard because they've alienated so many fans over the past decade to the point where Retail WoW has lost its identity from what made it so likable in the first place, and I don't know if it'll ever recover from it.
Someone once said that you can't go home again, but they lacked vision. And a temporal discombobulator.
Now, Classic WoW on the other hand is a bit of a different story because it's the version of the game that's literally made for the OG WoW players. Because Retail WoW was such a huge departure from what made Classic so fun, many of the old WoW enjoyers felt alienated by what it had become, and thus many of them stopped playing altogether. So in 2019, Blizzard launched WoW Classic, a version of World of Warcraft that currently only goes up to the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. And this launch has been met with overwhelming praise because it's the exact thing that the disaffected WoW players have been wanting for years. And it's not like Blizzard just released Classic and forgot about it. They're actively trying to spice it up with a seasonal model where they introduce completely unique gameplay changes to the game that make it really fun to play. Like with the Season of Discovery and even Hardcore Classic if you really want to. The player base seems to be really satisfied with Classic WoW for the most part. This is legitimately a rare Blizzard W because they re-release an older version of their most popular game. You know, the version of the game before they fucked it all up. So this is the one Blizzard game that they haven't ruined. Yet.
Lilith.
Moving on, we have Diablo 4, and all I gotta say about this game is, what the hell happened? This is probably one of Blizzard's biggest fumbles that they've ever had. The devs had a complete blueprint on how to make Diablo 4 an amazing game, but they've dropped the ball so hard with it. This is probably one of Blizzard's biggest fumbles that they've ever had. Every lesson and every piece of feedback learned from the previous Diablo games were just thrown out the window. D4 genuinely felt like a regression from the previous games because the devs have made so many backwards fundamental decisions that would ultimately cause many players to drop the game very shortly after launch. Some of the biggest criticisms levied at Diablo 4 at release was that the overall quality of life of the gameplay was just really poor, which made the game super arduous to play through. Some examples include having only a handful of stash tabs which was shared between all of your characters.
Great to see that you guys took what the community said to heart, but why are we only getting one stash tab? Why is there a problem to add a load of them or even unlimited? Okay, this is the explanation. When we say they are expensive, what we mean is they create a lot of memory overhead. When you see another player in game, you load them and their entire stash filled with all of their items. This is what teams have been working so diligently to improve so that we can have more as soon as possible.
No loot filter and no way to search for a specific item in your stash. Resistances straight up didn't work. Dungeons were extremely unfun to do because the objectives had you backtracking all over the place. And the aspect system in general is just clunky to use. Now, to be fair, some of these things were fixed a few months after launch in later seasons, which means that the dev team is listening, albeit a bit too slow. But the core fundamental problems still remain present in the game, and until these issues are fixed, Diablo 4 is going to remain in a dire state. The first problem is with the itemization. Loot is just straight up unfun to get in this game because of all the generic and unimaginative stats that really just serve as filler for the affix pool. Every item can roll a plethora of almost useless stats that only function in very specific scenarios. So oftentimes you'll be sitting in town for 15 to 20 minutes just sifting through your items one by one to determine which useless stat is better. You have a huge selection of such riveting affixes such as damage to chilled enemies, or damage to frozen enemies, or damage with frost. The itemization in D4 is needlessly convoluted for absolutely no reason at all. And not only that, but for a long period of time, there was no way to reliably get the best tier of items, uniques. All you could do if you wanted to get the best items is kill random shit and hope you get lucky with a 0.002% drop chance. It was only until 4 months later in Season 2 where the devs finally introduced an uber boss that reliably drops unique items, but the damage had already been done and many players had already left at this point. The second fundamental problem with D4 is that it's lacking any meaningful endgame content. Once you finish with the campaign, you're introduced to the endgame gameplay loop, which consists of repeating the same nightmare dungeons, doing the mind-numbing hell tides, and sometimes killing uber bosses. That's it. As you can tell, there isn't much variety with the endgame content, especially if you were just a casual player, which is the target audience of this game. So most of Diablo 4's audience got bored or frustrated and stopped playing altogether, but they still held on to hope that one day Blizzard would listen to player feedback and quickly rectify these issues in the future. Well, Season 1 rolls around and it was poorly received because it added some incredibly boring content while also nerfing a lot of player power, making the game even more of a slog to play through, putting into question if the devs were really listening. Season 2 is generally better received as it would feature more engaging content and would add a sort of band-aid solution to the unique item drop problem. And now at the time of this video, we're currently in the middle of Season 3, which has also felt underwhelming to a large part of the player base because it didn't really have an interesting core gameplay mechanic, causing players to once again drop the game. 9 months after launch, the core fundamental problems still persist in the current version, and players have pretty much lost all hope with this game and have all but abandoned D4. That was until March 20th in the latest developer live stream where they announced Season 4 of the game, which sought out to totally revamp the itemization and endgame content. These changes pinpointed the exact fundamental issues that were plaguing the game and pledged to completely rework them based on the community feedback. And for the most part, these changes received overwhelming praise because the devs finally addressed the biggest problems players had. This may be the final chance that Diablo 4 has in order to revive the game because at this point, the fans are at their wits' end. Now, fans are waiting with bated breath for Season 4 to launch in May and hopefully put an end to this long overdue extended beta test. The next biggest fumble that Blizzard ever had is with Overwatch 2, or should I say Overwatch 1.5 because it's essentially the same game. This game used to be such a cultural phenomenon back when it was released in 2016. Everybody was talking about Overwatch back then and how they loved the colorful cast of iconic characters that are still well beloved to this very day. And each one of their cinematics were masterfully crafted in a way that builds up the world of this game and gives a personality to these characters. TF2 might have been the first one to start the hero shooter concept, but Overwatch definitely was the one to popularize it. Blizzard had a smash hit on their hands, and the only way that this could ever start failing is if Blizzard themselves kill it. Which is exactly what happened because this game has just been so poorly mismanaged to the point where it killed all the goodwill left with the fanbase. And now it's just an empty, soulless husk of what it once was. It's really sad to see how the public sentiment of Overwatch slowly got worse and worse over the years, to the point where people now look at the once great hero shooter with disappointment and disdain at what it's become. Now obviously Overwatch 1 still had its problems, like with the massive power creep of the newer characters like Brigitte and the double tank meta making the game absolutely unfun to play and watch. Even Blizzard themselves knew that there were fundamental problems with the game, and thus they set out to fix these issues by announcing a sequel. Not only did Overwatch 2 propose to remedy a lot of the problems present within the first one, but it also promised a fully fledged PvE game mode complete with highly in-depth talent trees and replayable story missions. Everyone and their grandmother was so hyped to finally have an Overwatch story mode that expanded upon the rich lore that Blizzard has built up for this universe. This was something that fans have been wanting for a very long time, and this announcement had reignited their excitement for the future of this game. Naturally, since they begun production on Overwatch 2, they would stop adding new content to Overwatch 1, and the game would see a massive content drought because of it. The last hero release before Overwatch 2 was in 2020, and for 2 whole years, Overwatch would not see any new hero releases. And not only that, but special events were constantly being recycled, killing all hype for them. But the fans persisted and held on to hope that Overwatch 2 would save the franchise and return it to the good old glory days. Now fast forward a few years to October 2nd, 2022, the release day of Overwatch 2. The sequel that was supposed to save the Overwatch franchise, but it turns out that it was no more than just a glorified update. The most notable changes were that it went from a 6v6 to a 5v5, some of the heroes had their kits reworked, and the loot boxes were removed in favor of a battle pass system that locked the brand new heroes behind a paywall. Aside from these changes, everything else felt pretty much the same, which begged the question, what was even the point of making a sequel? That question would be further echoed by fans once they realized that Overwatch 2 had no PvE or story mode whatsoever, the whole reason why they wanted to make a sequel in the first place. But no worries though, Blizzard said that it would be delayed and eventually released at a later date, so with that in mind, the disgruntled fans soldiered on with Overwatch 2, patiently waiting for the long-promised PvE game mode. That was until May 16th, 2023 in the developer livestream where the devs announced that they would be scrapping Overwatch's single-player mode and would be entirely focusing on the multiplayer aspect.
Rate this game at the level that you deserve. It's clear that we can't deliver on that original vision for PvE that was shown in 2019. What that means is that we won't be delivering that dedicated hero mode with talent trees, that long-term power progression. Those things just aren't in our plans anymore. And we know that this is going to be disappointing to many of you, which is why we wanted to bring it up before we talked about the roadmap. And to be perfectly honest, it's been really difficult for many of us and a lot of folks on the team who've poured their heart and soul into that.
As a compromise, they promised they would periodically release smaller story missions to appease the disappointed fans. But they couldn't even fulfill that promise, as they would eventually announce that even those were cancelled on March 22nd, 2024, fully snuffing out any hopes of a PvE ever coming to Overwatch 2. This news felt like a gut punch to all the fans patiently waiting through thick and thin in hopes that one day they would be delivered the one thing that was heavily advertised, only to have the rug pulled from them at the very last moment. And the reasoning was because it took too much time away from the multiplayer. So that would beg the question, what were they doing during the 4 to 5 years of development time between Overwatch 1 and 2? For what reason did Overwatch 1 have to suffer through years of content drought? Did it really take them that long to remove one slot on a team, change the monetization model, and add a few maps? Players had endured the massive content drought in Overwatch 1 only to not even get the one thing that they've been asking for. And not only that, but Overwatch 2 had removed many fan favorite features and replaced them with unwanted ones instead. Like how the generous loot box system was replaced with a greedy battle pass that locks the new heroes behind a paywall, something that was entirely free in the first game. This was a huge slap in the face to everybody who was hopeful for a revival of Overwatch, and thus many fans completely dropped the game while expressing their frustrations on the internet. Now Overwatch 2 sits at a 17% positive rating on Steam and a 1.5 user score on Metacritic, with no hope of ever getting any better. They did announce that starting Season 10, all heroes would finally be free to play, so maybe some people will come back to the game, but the damage has been done already, and the future of Overwatch 2 seems bleak. But that's just me. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? And if you have any suggestions on the next gaming decline I should do, let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content in the future. See ya.